Hey guys, watching the JavaScript Mastery series, and in this video we are going to take a deep dive into strings. We are going to be exploring strings inside out and making sure we know everything that we need to know about strings to make sure we got our basics and fundamentals down. So first we're going to look at creating strings and the different ways that we can create them. We will be looking at how to handle escape sequences and deal with special characters. Then we'll move on to manipulating strings, how to concatenate strings, how to deal with multi-line strings. Then we'll also look at how we can utilize template strings to do this more effectively. We will look at accessing strings and the different characters within that string, as well as how we can use the length property on strings to track the amount of characters in a string. Finally, we will explore JavaScript's rich API and how we can utilize it to solve common string related problems effectively. This video is going to be ranked blue belt, so we are going to be keeping it super beginner friendly. Let's get started. There is 3 different ways we can create a string in JavaScript. Now let's just focus on the 2 most common ones that we're going to use for creating basic strings, the double quote and the single quote. Now there's no major advantage to which one you use. There's no performance benefits to either one. Maybe you can make a slight argument that the single quote is slightly less characters, although they work out being the same length anyway. So yeah, no real benefit. The most important thing is be consistent in your code base for readability. So if you're using single quotes, just stick with single quotes. If you're using double quotes, just stick with double quotes. Yeah, so just be consistent, especially if you're working on a team of people all contributing to the same code base. Just have that consistent style that you use and you stick to. Now then, as you can see, we're using these quotations, right? Now, sometimes in a string, we may need to introduce a quote, right? We need to use a single quote within that string. So it's a string. Then imagine I've had this quote in here. As you can see, JavaScript thinks that the string has ended, right? Because you got the single quote there, it thinks it's ended. Now, when we want to utilize these characters within a string without JavaScript thinking it's ended, we want to use a backslash. Now this backslash is used to escape quotes inside the strings, as you can see here, as well as being able to use other special characters such as tabs and new line. So maybe sentence 2 equal. Now maybe within this string we want to break it down onto a new line. Oh, my bad. TS node strings. It's a beautiful day. Let's go out and play. Now we can also use these backslashes for special characters, such as starting a new line. So it's a beautiful day. Let's go out and play. And as you can see, using this backslash, before this special character, we can break this onto a new line. We can also do this if we want to use tabs, for example. So maybe that's T. And as you can see, we're able to introduce that tab. And for these special characters, we need it following a backslash. Also, we can concatenate strings together. So maybe for some reason we want to combine these sentences. We can use this concatenation string. We've seen this with numbers before. However, we can also use it with strings if we want to combine 2 sentences together, just 2 strings together. And as you can see, it's a string. Make that slightly easier to read. And just like that, we can combine these strings together using concatenation. Now, this doesn't look too useful because you could have just written this at the beginning here. However, these become more useful when introducing dynamic variables. So maybe player name equals player 1, and then maybe we want to introduce a sentence that says you completed the level. So there you go. Using concatenation, we can introduce this dynamic variable, because player 1 could be player 2, could be player 3. We can just, whatever the value is, we can just introduce it into this variable here. Now, doing this can begin to get slightly ugly as this sentence gets long, right? So let's say we wanted to introduce another string, and we want to say the next level is, and then we want to get the current level. As we start to put all of this into a string, so it begins to get a little bit ugly. And for this, and so when you end up in this scenario where you're combining loads of strings together and injecting dynamic variables into that string, it becomes a lot cleaner to introduce a template string. And there you go, we can introduce these dynamic variables using a template string while wrapping these dynamic variables in these dollar quotation marks. So when your strings begin to become a bit tricky and hard to read, always better practice to use those template strings. Most people just tend to use them once you're introducing just a single dynamic variable. It does look a lot tidier and cleaner to read. It's just a better way to embed variables into our string. It's better for readability and working with dynamic content. Just like with numbers, we can compare strings, and as strings are primitives, they are compared by their value. So maybe I have a player name equals player 1, and constant player name b equals player 2. And if we was to compare these together, as you can see, they're clearly false. If this one was to have the same name, we can compare those and they would be true. Now, this here is pretty straightforward, but their comparisons are slightly more complicated, and when we begin looking at how we can compare values. So it looks slightly weird at first, but we can indeed compare values just like this. Now, this looks a bit weird when it comes to strings, because how can one string be less than another? Surely this is just a numeric comparison, right? But actually it's not. We can actually use this with strings as well. So if we run this, we say it's true. Now, the way this works in JavaScript when it comes to strings is when we use these comparison operators, such as since is less than and greater than, those JavaScript looks at the unicorn value of each character. So each character in JavaScript has a Unicode value. For example, we could also do console.log apple less than banana, and apple is indeed less than banana. But if we was to make this a capital letter, we will see it's false, because this Unicode value is actually, Unicode value of B is less than A. So using chart at, we're going to access the value of A, and let's see what that looks like. And it is 97. Now, if we was to look at the Unicode value of, let's just go lowercase b, it is 98. So 98 is obviously greater than 97, and that's why if we was to say, well, is B less than A, that is true. Let's make this slightly easier to read. Let's see the same here. Okay, so A's Unicode value is 97. B's Unicode value is 98. So A is obviously less than B. However, when we look at the uppercase value of B, the value is 66. And of course, A is not going to be less than 66. So when we use the lower and greater than operators in JavaScript for strings, the comparison is done from left than right, and it's done based on the Unicode value of those strings. These can come in handy when you have a list of strings that you might want to order by alphabetical order, for example, right? It's very common when reading a list of names on some kind of register, or you have some kind of list. It's very common that you want to order those by alphabetical order in the user interface, and this is one scenario where this begins to become useful. So in JavaScript, strings actually, in a weird kind of way, behave a lot like arrays. You see, it's almost like an array of characters. We can loop through an array. We can access the individual characters in an array using bracket notations, just like an array. And also those strings have a length property, just like an array. So when we have a string here, sentence, we can actually access each individual character in this string using the index, just like you would with an array. So if I was to do sentence 0, just like an array, I can access the first character. And just like an array, strings are 0 indexing, meaning the first character starts at position 0, just as I demonstrated here. Again, if we do 1, 2, and 3, those blank spaces should count as a character, as you would expect. And we can also loop over this sentence just like we can with an array. So if we do let char of sentence and we log that out, we should be able to access each individual element of that string, as you can see right here. Now then, it's not very common to do this in a real world scenario. I actually can't think of an actual use case since I've been coding where I've needed to loop over a string and access the individual characters. However, it is still useful to know and demonstrates your knowledge of the language, especially when it comes to things like coding challenges in coding interviews. I do recall one time I was asked, how would you reverse a string? So constant reverse sentence, let I equal sentence length minus 1. If I was to run that, hopefully that looks like something like a reverse sentence. Now, of course, you could just use a built-in method like this. Now, not only can we loop over these values and access these values just like we can in array, but we can actually find out how many characters are within a string just by accessing the length property, which comes available on strings, and this is going to automatically stay updated with the amount of characters in a string. So for example, maybe if you had a password on your web application and you needed to have a minimum length of characters, which we've seen plenty of times, right? We could just use this. So maybe constant password equals top secret password. And then maybe we need to do something like password is strong enough. Now for the password to be strong enough, it might need to have a minimum length of 15 and it will pass. Now in JavaScript, when we work with strings, we get to utilize JavaScript's rich string API, which is capable of doing solving a lot of common problems and doing a lot of common tasks that we want to do, but without us having to do it ourselves. So let's just take a quick look at that and some of the things that we can do out of the box. So guys, just taking a look at some of the most common string methods. Well, not technically a method, it's a property, but we can get the length of a string. We can use this char@ to access different characters at different places of the strings. You can just use this using those braces. We can get the index of a character, or in this case a word. We can check if a string includes a word. We can check if it starts a word, ends a word. We can modify our strings. So maybe you want to make all of your characters in your string lowercase. Maybe you want to make them uppercase. Or one thing that's very common when it comes to validating and sanitizing user inputted data is trimming those white spaces from the beginning and the end of the string. We may even want to replace a word. Maybe you know, you have a welcome message and you want to replace a part of the string with the player's name. We can also do some cool things by manipulating the string with the substring slice. We can use split to take a long string and split it into array. We can even concatenate strings. You get the picture, right? When it comes to using JavaScript, those strings are gonna come with a lot of powerful methods that we can utilize to do a lot of heavy lifting and solve a lot of common problems, so we don't have to do this ourselves. And this matters because being familiar with JavaScript's rich API is going to save us a lot of time. It's also going to make our code a lot cleaner, right? We're not going to have to go away and write 50, 60 lines of code to do something which we can just utilize in JavaScript when it already comes with a built-in method. And it's going to be more reliable and trustworthy because we can be sure that that method that we're using has already been used by millions of other developers before us and has made its way into part of the language. So guys, that's a little bit of information on the JavaScript API that's available to strings. Now, the important thing isn't to try and memorize all of these methods and have them in the top of your head ready to go. The most important thing is just knowing that they exist and knowing where to go to look to see if there is a method available to solve the problem that you're having. The last thing you want to do is be in a coding interview and spending 20 minutes doing something, writing manual loops, conditions, and doing messy string manipulation when you can just leverage an existing method, solve the problem at hand, and move on. So it's going to save you a lot of time. It's going to make your code cleaner. It's going to solve a lot of common problems a lot more efficiently. So we looked at the different ways that we can create a string, the single quote and double quote. We discussed that there's no benefit between them, but it is important to be consistent. We then looked at how we deal with special characters in a string and how we can utilize backticks for special characters. Then we looked at the template string and how it can be super useful when we are manipulating a string and we want to add dynamic content in a nice clean way that's more easier to read. Then we discussed how strings in JavaScript are a lot like an array of characters and how we can loop through those characters in a string just like you can with an array, and also looked at the existence of that length property that exists for strings as well. Then finally we moved on to exploring JavaScript's rich API and we looked at how we can solve common problems more effectively. So if you had any value from this video, please like it and I will see you in the next one.